Colombia had a government, courts, police, military, politicians. Every institution a functioning democracy needs. Pablo Escobar did not destroy those institutions. He bought them, one by one, judge by judge, general by general, and the ones he could not buy, he buried. What you are about to hear is not the story of a drug lord. You already know that story. This is the story of something far more disturbing. This is the story of how one man from a poor neighborhood in Medellin looked at an entire country and decided to buy it, and how Colombia, institution by institution, said yes. Pablo Escobar never trusted governments, not because he was paranoid, because he had watched one his entire life. He grew up in Rionegro, Colombia, a country where the police beat poor people on principle, where judges answered to landowners, where politicians gave speeches in the capital while the countryside starved, where every institution that was supposed to protect ordinary people instead protected who ever could afford to pay for protection. Escobar watched all of that as a child, and he drew a conclusion that would eventually shake an entire continent. Everything has a price. Every man has a number, and any government built by human beings can be unbought, rebought, and redirected by whoever controls enough money. That was not cynicism. That was observation. Before the cocaine empire, before the bombings and the kidnappings and the body counts that would eventually make Pablo Escobar the most hunted man on earth, there was a young man in Medellin running small scams, stealing cars, selling contraband cigarettes, moving fake lottery tickets, nothing that would suggest what was coming, except for one thing. Even in those early days, Escobar never operated without paying someone, a local police officer here, a municipal official there. He learned young that the fastest way to stay out of prison was not to be clever enough to avoid getting caught. It was to make sure the people doing the catching worked for you. By the time cocaine arrived and the money it generated made everything before it looked like pocket change, Escobar already had a fully developed philosophy about how power worked in Colombia. He had tested it on a small scale. He had watched it succeed. Now he had the resources to apply it at a scale no one in Colombian history had ever attempted. He looked at the country's judicial system and saw a collection of men earning government salaries in a country with runaway inflation and rampant poverty. He looked at the military and saw officers with families and mortgages, and no real loyalty to institutions that had never protected them either. He looked at Congress and saw career politicians whose entire existence depended on campaign financing in a country with no serious campaign finance laws. He did not see enemies. He did not see obstacles. He saw a shopping list. The strategy he developed had a name that became famous across Latin America: plata o plomo, silver or lead, money or bullets. Take the payment and look the other way, or refuse the payment and face the other thing. But that framing misses something important, because Escobar always preferred the silver. Violence was expensive. Violence drew attention. Violence created martyrs who inspired resistance. Money was cleaner. Money was quieter. Money built relationships that lasted years. The lead was only for the ones who forgot that the silver was never really optional. Colombia had no idea what was coming. By the early 1980s, the Medellin cartel was generating more money per month than most Colombian institutions saw in a year. The cocaine pipeline into the United States was producing billions, and Escobar now had both the resources and the motivation to begin systematically converting that money into something more durable than cash. He began converting it into control. The process was methodical. Escobar did not approach targets randomly. Before any offer was made, his people died. ID research, thorough, patient research. They identified the target's salary, his debts, his family situation, his weaknesses. Did he have a sick child with medical bills he could not cover? Did he have a mistress whose existence his wife did not know about? Did he owe money to someone dangerous? Did he have ambitions that his current position would never satisfy? The first approach was always respectful, always indirect. A trusted intermediary, never anyone connected directly to the cartel. A conversation over dinner or coffee. An observation that times were hard, a mention that there were people who could help a man in his position, a number mentioned quietly, a handshake, a promise of discretion. The offer was always generous, not insultingly large, not so enormous that it would feel like a trap, but enough to pay off the debt, enough to fund the mistress's apartment for another year, enough to send the child to a better doctor, enough that saying no would require a man to look his own family in the eye and explain why he chose principle over their security. Most men did not say no. The ones who did received a second visit, this one less comfortable, this one with a clearer message. The choice was still the same. The only thing that had changed was what the lead meant now. Within 3 years of the Medellin cartel reaching full operational capacity, Escobar had established corrupted relationships inside virtually every major institution in Colombia. This was not bribery in the ordinary sense. This was infrastructure. A parallel administrative structure running beneath the visible surface of the Colombian state, taking money from Escobar's network on one side, delivering information, protection, and obstruction on the other. Colombia's judicial system was the foundation on which everything else Escobar built depended. If the courts worked, cases against cartel members would succeed, traffickers would go to prison, extradition requests would be processed. The entire operation would eventually collapse under the weight of its own legal exposure, so the courts had to not work, and Escobar made sure they did not. The approach to judges was identical to the approach to every other target. Research first, financial pressure identified, family situation documented, the offer made through intermediaries, most accepted. But the Colombian judiciary presented a specific problem that other institutions did not. Some judges had genuine convictions, men and women who had chosen the law as a vocation, not a career, who believed in what they were doing, who could not be reached by money or fear for their own safety, because they had already decided that what they were protecting was worth more than their lives. Escobar found those judges too, he just dealt with them differently. Between 1981 and 1993, over 200 Colombian judges were assassinated. 200! Men and women murdered in their cars, in their homes, walking to their offices, sitting in restaurants. The message delivered with each killing was precise and unmistakable. Neutrality was not an option. Every judge in Colombia was being asked the same question: whose side are you on? And they were being asked it with a gun. The ones who took the money stayed alive. The ones who refused became statistics in a war their government could not admit it was losing. The most significant moment came in 1984. Justice Minister Rodrigo Lara Bonilla had done something almost no Colombian official at his level had dared to do. He stood up publicly. He named names. He identified cartel connections to political figures. He pushed for genuine enforcement of drug laws. He refused every approach. On April 30, 1984, Rodrigo Lara Bonilla was shot dead in his car in Bogotá. He was 37 years old. His assassination sent a message to every government official in Colombia that no position, no title, no level of protection was sufficient cover if you chose the wrong side. The justice minister of the country was not safe. Nobody was safe. And in the weeks after Lara Bonilla's murder, Escobar watched what Colombia did. He watched the government make statements. He watched them promise action. He watched them increase security for officials. He watched them do exactly what governments always do when confronted with violence they do not know how to stop. He watched, and he continued building. If the judiciary was the foundation, the military and police were the walls. And Escobar built those walls just as carefully. Colombia's security forces in the 1980s were an institution with a specific institutional problem. They were fighting multiple wars simultaneously. The FARC guerrillas in the countryside, the ELN, paramilitary violence, political instability. Officers were exhausted, underpaid, and operating in an environment of constant danger with equipment that was often inadequate and institutional support that was frequently absent. Into that environment, Escobar inserted money. Police commanders in Medellin received regular payments from cartel intermediaries, not occasional bribes, regular payments, monthly, like a salary supplement from an employer who expected performance in return. In exchange, those commanders provided advance warning of operations, raid schedules, informant identities, intelligence assessments, anything the cartel needed to stay one step ahead of the enforcement operations theoretically designed to shut them down. The result was a law enforcement apparatus that was comprehensively pointed in the wrong direction. Operations against Escobar were planned in offices where at least one person at the table was passing information to the cartel. Informants inside the cartel were identified and quietly eliminated before they could testify. Safe houses were never raided when Escobar was actually present. The Colombian military presented a similar picture. Officers at multiple levels of the chain of command were on the cartel payroll, not low-level grunts. Colonels, intelligence officers, men whose access to classified information about counter-narcotics operations was comprehensive. That information moved from military intelligence offices to Escobar's people with a regularity that, when investigators later reconstructed it, was genuinely staggering. The search block the elite unit created specifically and exclusively to find and capture or kill Pablo Escobar was itself infiltrated almost from the moment it was established. Officers within the unit passed information about surveillance operations, communication intercept strategies, and planned tactical movements directly to the man they were supposed to be hunting. Escobar knew about operations against him before the officers conducting those operations had finished their planning meetings. But of everything Escobar built, the political network was the most audacious. Because politics required a different kind of transaction. A judge could be bought with cash. An officer could be supplemented with a monthly payment. A politician required something more complex. A politician required the appearance of legitimacy. Escobar understood this, which is why when he decided to enter Colombian politics himself, he did not do it quietly. He ran for Congress. In 1982, Pablo Escobar Gaviria was elected as an alternate representative to the Colombian Chamber of Representatives for the Envigado district. He sat in the Colombian Congress. He attended sessions. He made speeches. He took photographs in the halls of power. He built relationships with elected officials who either did not know what he was or chose not to ask questions about the source of the campaign contributions that were keeping their own political operations running. Through his political network, Escobar achieved something that pure money and violence could not. He achieved embedded influence. Mayors in Antioquia who owed their elections to cartel support, governors whose campaign operations had been funded through structures designed to obscure the origin of contributions, legislators who understood that certain topics were not to be raised, certain investigations not to be pushed, certain votes not to be cast against cartel interests. He was not running Colombia's government, he was running a layer beneath it, a shadow administration that shaped decisions, blocked threats, and moved resources through the formal political system as easily as cocaine moved through his distribution networks. The Colombian media was the last major institution to fall, and it fell in the way that institutions that depend on powerful people for access always fall, quietly, gradually, without a single dramatic moment that could be identified as the turning point. Editors received phone calls. Advertising accounts were placed with publications that covered the cartel favorably. Journalists who investigated too aggressively found their sources drying up, their editors suddenly uninterested in our work, their careers stalling in ways that were difficult to prove were connected to anything specific. The ones who kept pushing found something more direct waiting for them. Guillermo Cano Isaza was the editor of El Espectador, one of Colombia's most respected newspapers. Under his direction, El Espectador published investigations into Escobar's criminal history, his cartel connections, the corrupted networks that protected him. Cano refused every approach, refused every inducement, kept publishing. On December 17, 1986, Guillermo Cano was shot dead outside the El Espectador offices in Bogotá as he was leaving work. After his murder, Colombian journalism changed, not all of it. There were still brave reporters and editors who kept working. But the overall environment shifted. The calculation every journalist in Colombia had to make shifted. The question was no longer just whether a story was true and important. The question was whether it was worth dying for. Most editors started making different decisions. But of everything Pablo Escobar purchased in Colombia, the most extraordinary acquisition was the country's constitution itself. The single policy that Escobar feared above all others was extradition to the United States. American courts could not be bribed. American judges did not receive visits from intermediaries with soft offers and quiet promises. An American prison sentence meant the end. No network, no money, no power. Just a concrete cell and a 50-year sentence with no possibility of the kind of creative legal maneuvering that had kept him free in Colombia. So Escobar decided to eliminate extradition, not to fight it in court. Not to bribe individual officials into blocking individual extradition requests. He decided to make extradition constitutionally impossible, to have it written out of Colombia's founding legal document at the source. Colombia was drafting a new constitution in 1991, a democratic process involving a constitutional assembly of elected delegates, a process that was supposed to represent the will of the Colombian people. Escobar turned it into one of the most expensive lobbying operations in the history of the Western Hemisphere. Money moved into the campaigns of Constitutional Assembly delegates through structures so layered and complex that tracing it back to the cartel required years of forensic financial investigation. Death threats were delivered to delegates who showed signs of supporting extradition provisions. Several delegates who seemed unmovable received visits that clarified what unmovable actually cost. The Constitutional Assembly of 1991 produced a new Colombian constitution that explicitly banned the extradition of Colombian nationals. Pablo Escobar, from a position of theoretical legal jeopardy, had rewritten his country's constitution to protect himself. He had purchased the foundational legal document of a democratic nation the same way he purchased everything else. One person at a time, one page, at a time. Not everyone said yes. That is the part of Escobar's story that gets lost in the scale of what he built. Because the network was so comprehensive, because the corruption was so deep, it is easy to conclude that Colombia simply surrendered, that there was no resistance, that everyone could be bought. That is not true. Some refused, and their refusals cost them everything. Rodrigo Lara Bonilla refused and was killed at 37. Luis Carlos Galán was the leading presidential candidate in 1989. A genuine reformer who had publicly named cartel connections to political figures and called for a return to extradition. On August 18, 1989, Galán was addressing a campaign rally in Soca when gunmen opened fire. He died that night. Colonel Valdemar Franklin Quintero, the commander of the Antioquia police, refused cartel payments and ran aggressive enforcement operations against Medellin cartel structures. He was assassinated in November 1989. Attorney General Carlos Moro H. Hoyos was kidnapped and killed in 1988 after refusing to back down from extradition proceedings. Each murder served two purposes. It eliminated a specific threat, and it delivered an updated message to everyone watching. The message that the cost of refusal had not changed, that the network Escobar had built was still functioning, that the choice between silver and lead remained open. What Escobar never fully accounted for was that some of the men he could not buy would eventually find ways to fight him that money could not stop. By 1992, the architecture that had protected Escobar for a decade began showing cracks. The Cali cartel, his primary rival, made a strategic decision. They began actively assisting Colombian and American authorities with intelligence about Escobar's network, not out of civic conscience, out of competitive interest. A Medellin cartel destroyed by law enforcement was a market advantage for Cali. The intelligence they provided was specific and actionable in ways years of official investigation had failed to produce. Because Cali knew where the bodies were buried, they had been watching the same network from the outside for years. Simultaneously, a vigilante organization called Los Pepes People, persecuted by Pablo Escobar, began systematically dismantling Escobar's support infrastructure. Lawyers who worked for him, accountants who managed his money, intermediaries who maintained his corrupt relationships, associates who provided safe houses and logistics. Los Pepes moved through that network with a brutality that matched Escobar's own, and underneath all of it, the accumulated weight of a decade of violence had finally produced something Escobar had not anticipated. Colombians who were genuinely done, not officials who could be bought, not institutions that could be compromised. Ordinary citizens who had lost family members, who had lived under the terror of bombings and assassinations for 10 years, and who were willing to call the tip. Lines that authorities had established. The tip that finally located Escobar on December 1, 1993, came from a phone call. His son later confirmed that Escobar had called his family from a Medellin safe house. The call was traced. The search block moved within hours. On December 2, 1993, Pablo Escobar was shot dead on a rooftop in the Los Olivos neighborhood of Medellin. He was 44 years old. His network did not die with him. Parts of it survived for years. Individual relationships he had built continued to function. Officials he had compromised remained in their positions. The institutional damage he had done to Colombia's judiciary, military, and political system was not repaired by a single gunshot on a Medellin rooftop. Recovery took decades. Some would argue it is still ongoing. Here is the question that Escobar's story demands. How does one man buy an entire country? The simple answer is money. He had more of it than the institutions he was targeting had ever seen. And in a country with deep poverty, structural inequality, and institutions that had never been strong enough to generate genuine loyalty from the people working within them, Money was sufficient to do extraordinary damage, but the real answer is more uncomfortable than that. Escobar did not create the corruption he exploited. He found it already there. He found judges who were already susceptible, officers who were already underpaid and undervalued, politicians who were already operating in a system where money determined outcomes, journalists who were already working in an environment where powerful people expected favorable coverage. He did not corrupt Colombia. He revealed how corruptible it already was. He held up a mirror to every institution in the country and showed Colombia what those institutions were actually made of when the price was high enough. That is the real verdict on Pablo Escobar. Not the body count, not the cocaine tonnage, not the billions of dollars. The verdict is this: he found a country full of cracks, and he poured money into every single one of them, and the country cracked. The question that Colombia spent the next 3 decades trying to answer was not how to stop the next Escobar. It was how to build institutions strong enough that the next Escobar could not buy them in the first place. That question does not have a simple answer. It never did. But it starts with understanding exactly what happened, exactly who said yes, and exactly what it cost everyone when they did.